I'm just checking the participants for any more people joining. Make sure that as many people that registered can get logged in before we get started. And I'm getting our YouTube live stream running here real quick, and then we'll get started in just a minute. I'm just checking the participants for any more people joining. Make sure that as many people that registered can get. Quick heads up for the panelists. We have some breaking news that I saw today from NBC that there's some studies that are potentially looking at combination of one dose of one vaccine and a dose of another vaccine. I wanted to possibly throw that out as a possible question today. Would any of you have interest in weighing in on that question? Or is it too new? You're not sure about it. No problem. I just that's why I wanted to ask, because it literally just broke not very long ago. It sounded interesting.
Certainly, it's
I think that the only thing oh, go ahead. Please,
it's certainly a study that should be done. We want to see the information, but there's nothing to comment on in terms of whether that's going to be a useful strategy or not. It would be great if it were.
Dr. Shen, would you have any other thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Dr. McKinney is right, that it's the right thing to do to take a look at this mix and match and to see whether or not it's safe. But short of anything beyond that, it's really difficult to comment. I think that you can comment around the context around why folks are doing it, but in terms of what it potentially means, but very speculative.
Yeah, we'll follow the story, and maybe we'll keep in touch and ask you what you think about it as it develops further. I think everyone who's going to be joining is joined, so I'll go ahead and hit record on our main recording, and we'll get started. Okay, welcome to this Newswise Live expert panel. We have with us three panelists today to talk about the current state of the COVID pandemic, as well as vaccine distribution and the changes in store under the new Biden administration. First, I want to put things into a little bit of context with the pandemic statistics at the moment. We are 4 weeks out from the peak of new daily infections. That was 300,000 new infections on January 8th. That's gradually dropped down to an average, a 7-day average of about 135,000 new cases a day. We also have been having consistently more than 3,000 deaths a day. I think the number was about 3,800 yesterday, which correlates to that peak of about a month ago. Things are obviously moving in the right direction. Is it light at the end of the tunnel, or is it a train that might run us over? So Dr. Shen, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about your background working in the federal government, and how you envision what changes will be implemented with the Biden administration coming in and stepping in. What are your thoughts about that, and what could change for the better about vaccine distribution and the general pandemic response?
Great, thanks so much. I am a retired captain in the U.S. Public Health Service. I worked in the federal government for over 2 decades at a number of agencies that you're probably much more common and familiar with now under the infrastructure of the Department of Health and Human Services. Agencies like CDC, FDA, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, as well as at USAID under the State Department. So thank you for inviting me here today with our esteemed panelists. You ask about kind of this current state of response and distribution. I think we are certainly have a lot of good news, and good news comes in many different forms every day. I think the singular thing that's driving how things will shift and change is that we had 2 vaccines under emergency use authorization. We have a 3rd vaccine, J&J, filing for emergency use, as well as 2 on the heels of that. And so in the forthcoming months or seasons, if you will, supply won't be so much of a problem. Clinic locations are kind of working out the kinks of registration, distribution, and how to manage. Every day we're vaccinating more people. So we've had to kind of go from 0 to 60 in a really short period of time. And we're expanding strategies in terms of sites of service, so where people can go, as we are waiting in the upcoming months to have more supply than demand, which is an inverse of the problem we've had before. So in terms of big picture, things should be looking much more different as we approach spring and summer. So those are kind of some general thoughts writ large to set the landscape.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shen. And by way of introduction of Dr. Shen, just to tell everyone how she's come to join us for this panel, she's currently visiting research scientist at the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as her status as a retired captain in U.S. Public Health Services. Thank you, Dr. Shen. We'll come back to you with some additional questions shortly. I want to next introduce Dr. McKinney. He's professor and associate dean at University of Louisville. And he's also, let me just spotlight his video. He's also the acting chair in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. And he's a member of the Louisville Metro Vaccination Task Force, assembled by the mayor there, Mr. Greg Fisher. Dr. McKinney, thanks so much for joining us. With your experience of getting things up and running and consulting on vaccination drives in a major metropolitan area such as yours, what are your thoughts about the progress, and what are your thoughts about the goal of administering as many as 2 million vaccines in a single day, and that being a good target for the right trajectory of getting the vaccine out there?
Well, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the president's team has stated clearly that the initially announced goal of 1 million doses per day administered was really a floor, not a ceiling. And the goal is to get as high as they possibly can. I think the number 2 million per day would be a reasonable next target. It's a doubling of what was previously announced, but we need to get up there pretty quickly because of the rate of mutation of the virus. And the mutants that we currently see appear to be still individuals who've been vaccinated will probably be protected from those strains so far as we know. But the margin, the buffer of protection is diminishing. And at some point, there's going to be obviously strains that emerge that will be resistant entirely to what we have to offer, and that will not, the vaccines available will not be protective against them. So we need to, stop the circulation of the current strains as quickly as possible. And the way to do that is to really roll out in a major way, like has been said by many, on a wartime type footing, the largest vaccination effort that we possibly can. So in the range of the 2 million or a little bit over a day would be something that would definitely change the trajectory of viral transmission over the next several months. I think it's doable. I think it's especially achievable if larger cities that can do this develop mass vaccination sites that can handle many thousands of individuals per day, either as drive-through events or walk-through events that are attended by large numbers. We have established the capability to do many thousand per day. We have in the past and did for the H1N1 swine flu event. We did 10,000 doses of vaccination a day at an outdoor drive-through event. I think that could easily be done here if we had sufficient vaccine. And so, if you have 10,000 doses per day at 200 sites around the country, that's 2 million doses right there. I think that's achievable. It's going to require effort. It's going to require coordination at the highest levels. And one thing that I've been trying to push for in every conference I've attended is the notion that there should be a coordination among the academic schools of health sciences training, schools of medicine, nursing, pharmacy, dentistry, public health, et cetera, can get together to help coordinate an approach that can be used to train students rapidly to fill in some roles in mass vaccination sites, that they can be there under supervision of faculty and provide an enormous reserve of personnel power for these kind of major efforts.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. To talk a little bit more about the vaccines and the development and manufacturing behind that supply that's hopefully getting out there at the volume needed to do 2 million a day, I want to introduce Dr. Kelvin Lee. He's director of the Manufacturing USA National Institute for Innovation and Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals. He also comes to us by way of being the Gore Professor of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at the University of Delaware. Dr. Lee, tell us about what's so remarkable in launching these 2 vaccines that have approval that are the first ever mRNA-based vaccines. And what does that kind of set us up for in terms of revolutionizing that as a platform for vaccines in general?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for having me with you today. You know, the space that I work in alongside scientific colleagues across academia and across industry is one where we think a lot about biotechnology-based medicines, whether they be monoclonal antibodies or vaccines and so on. And one of the really remarkable things about the mRNA-based vaccines is driven by this global pandemic is the speed with which these products could be brought to market. The real primary driver, I would argue, for developing vaccines using this mRNA approach is really based on the ability to respond rapidly. Now, a year may sound like a long time, but as I think we've heard about, you know, 1 year is far shorter than the development of most vaccines historically. And so I think the thing we've learned about the mRNA platform is that it has been successful in generating vaccines that, at least to date, have been shown to be very efficacious and safe and allow us to respond relatively quickly. And if I take that one step further and we think about mRNA as a platform, a manufacturing platform for bringing vaccines to market, you know, we start to hear about these variants and we worry broadly about the ability to escape immunity if the sequence variant changes enough so that we're not immunized against it. One of the really nice things about the manufacturing platforms used to make vaccines, including mRNAs, is that once you've established that platform for manufacturing, it becomes relatively simple and straightforward to swap out and adapt that vaccine to be prepared for the next variant or the next pathogen. I actually think about it a little bit like baking chocolate chip cookies. Now, it's a lot more complicated than baking chocolate chip cookies, but once you know how to make those cookies, and once you've figured out based on your oven and your elevation and you've got the recipe you like, whether you use milk chocolate chips or semi-sweet chocolate chips, it's relatively simple to swap those out. You don't have to relearn the whole manufacturing process. So I think the other thing about these platforms is not only the speed, but it also provides a framework for responding faster in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I want to open up the floor for questions. We have a question from freelancer Dan Keller. I want to invite him to ask the question himself. If you have a question, please do chat it to me. We'll invite you if you want to ask it yourself, or I'd be happy to read it for you. Dan, go ahead with your question.
Hi. Looking ahead, will future immunizations require a polyvalent vaccine incorporating various SARS-CoV-2 strains? And along that line, is the spike protein really the best target? Is there something more conserved protein or even an epitope on the virus, something that's more essential that would make for a more universal vaccine?
Thank you for the question, Dan. Any of our panelists want to start off on that question? Dr. Lee?
Sure, I'll take an attempt to try to answer some of that question. So I think it's a really great question. It's a really important question. I think, you know, as you look at the first generations of vaccines that have been brought to society, they certainly were designed to attack the virus. In particular, you mentioned the spike protein. They're designed to help our bodies recognize that molecule. And that's because based on the information we had in the early days, that was what we could build vaccines against. I think as we are learning more and more about SARS-CoV-2, and as we're seeing this kind of variety of strains emerging, certainly people are thinking about whether you would have the ability to vaccinate against multiple strains in a single dose, or whether you would think about other kinds of epitopes. Those are activities that I think are ongoing. People are exploring it. I think there's a lot of promise and hope in being able to deploy a vaccine that would address multiple strains and could be more universal in the future. It's not necessarily easy to do, but it certainly would be a tremendous advance. So in the community that I work in, people talk about getting that first generation vaccine out into society, and that's already happening now. And I know people are working on what would that second generation vaccine look like? What would that third generation vaccine look like? And that's where people start trying to address the questions that you're raising.
Dr. Shen, would you like to add to that?
It's tough to add on to a really great answer. I think that to build onto this concept of first generation and second, as you hear about other clinical trials staging down to earlier ages for pediatric and adolescent indications, that still I would clarify or point to kind of building onto the first generation of vaccines. And then exactly onto what Dr. Lee had said, the second generation asks a lot of those questions that you have pointed out in terms of whether or not this is the right target, and whether or not, as we learn more about the 3 new variants that are causing some concern. As we know, 2 of the companies that have existing EUAs in play, the Pfizer-BioNTech as well as the Moderna, have already announced some engagement about what a booster would look like. And then there's some data that has recently been released around J&J. And so I think that, as you noted, as well as Dr. Lee commented, it stands to reason that we need to wait to see what we learn from there and what we understand from some of the preliminary data, and that some of the studies around neutralizing antibodies aren't necessarily the totality of what we want to understand in the immune system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shen, and thank you for your question, Dan. I want to go to Dr. McKinney. Dr. McKinney, we've heard reports that some patients are experiencing some more severe side effects after getting the second dose of the vaccine. That's been something circulating in social media. What can you say to reassure people about that? Is that normal? What are those kinds of expected normal symptoms? What are adverse things to look out for? And what precautions are taking place to make sure that someone doesn't have a more severe reaction?
Well, I think that it's very fair to say that the types of reactions that have been mentioned pretty widely in the press, especially from the second dose of vaccine, are entirely expected. That's what has been seen in the clinical trials. That's what I've heard anecdotally from people who've gotten the vaccine, 2 doses. I've had a second dose myself because I'm a practitioner. I see patients still. And I can tell you that dose 2 was very noticeably different than dose 1. I did get some fever. I did get some chills. It was short-lived and, kind of a bad headache for a little while, but, you can tolerate that for a few hours or a day. It goes away and you're done with it. And it's a whole lot better than having gotten COVID. That's for sure. But people need to be aware that there are going to be some of these symptoms that may be mildly uncomfortable for a couple of days at most, probably, and less than a day for a majority of people, that no one should be pre-treating with Tylenol in expectation that they're going to get them. But if they do get something that's quite significant and they're not feeling well at all, they can't function normally, that they can take Tylenol as they need to for symptoms, but that for very mild fever, if you're talking about temperatures of 100.1, not 101, but 100.1, 100.5, low grade temperatures, things like that, there's not any urgency about treatment. You can you just manage symptomatically, drinking lots of liquids, taking a cool shower or something like that. It's no big deal. It's not harmful to tolerate a low level of temperature elevation, mild fever. But this is, evidence that the immune system is functioning. And the people who have 0 symptoms, you may question whether they're getting an appropriate immune response or not. The other thing is a sore arm. I mean, people get sore arms with pretty much any kind of injection. Certainly with influenza, it's very typical for the arm to hurt for a day or two mildly. And if you're not, if you're a right-handed person and who's a professional tennis player, that might be a big impediment. If you're the day after a shot and you got your shot in your dominant arm, but for the average person, you can work around to get it in the non-dominant arm, no big deal. The severe side effects are extremely rare. We are seeing some degree of severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis, but it's in the level of 2 episodes per million doses or 5 episodes per million doses, depending on vaccine. Pretty uncommon, and all the sites that are administering vaccine out there, all sites, but certainly ones of major size, do have emergency personnel on hand. They can administer epinephrine. They can intubate somebody if required. But no one has, to my knowledge, has ever died as a result of one of these types of reactions. They're readily treatable. They do respond quite well to standard therapy. And so long as we're forewarned and alerted to what can happen, I think that's the best information we can provide.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. Further on the topic of communicating with the public, I want to ask Dr. Shen, convincing people who've been, let's say, adverse to wearing masks and social distancing. We know that this still needs to happen even though the vaccines are out. We're not across the finish line yet. What would you say to try to convince those folks in that camp to start wearing masks and keep wearing masks and doing these other measures, even while they themselves maybe get vaccinated?
Behaviors matter. So even after vaccination, while you may be protected, as you rightly noted, you may still be able to transmit to others. The big takeaway is if you want to end this pandemic or get it under control, if you want to get back to life as close to as possible as it was before, then this really requires a collective effort. It's not just about you. It's really about also those around you. It's very analogous to how vaccines themselves work. Vaccines are very unique and different than other drugs or medical products, because by taking a vaccination, you protect yourself. But by taking a vaccination with a large proportion of your community taking a vaccination, it protects the community at large, which is how they've coined the term herd immunity or community immunity. And so in the same way as to how the function of vaccination occurs and works, in the same way that infectious diseases know no township or county or state or geopolitical lines and jurisdictions, if folks want to get back to some sense of normalcy, not the new normalcy, but closer to the normalcy that they remember but 1 year ago, then this requires not just thinking about you and the fact that you got a vaccination, but also about those around them. It's also noteworthy to point out that while highly efficacious these vaccines are, there is still a chance, though a small chance, that folks may also contract COVID as well. And so all this writ large, you're not necessarily out of the woods, but we're all progressing in this forward direction in a positive way, moving forward towards being, I guess, across the finish line. It's probably a bit more clear.
I want to dig into that just a tiny bit, one of those last things you said, because there was a very controversial video going viral on social media that purported to say that if you might still get the infection of the coronavirus itself, but it's not bad because you got the vaccine, you're able to fight it off, that was somehow controversial. This is a completely ordinary route of how vaccines work, right, Dr. Shen? That you may still get the virus infecting your cells, but then your body is able to mount the immune response, right?
Yeah, I think that the comment that I would typically say is to understand in that particular case, whether or not it was a failure to vaccinate or a vaccine failure, whether or not in the case in which there's a breakthrough case, it's because of the vaccine itself and conditions around that, or it had to do with suboptimal vaccination. It had to do with they perhaps only got 1 out of 2 doses. It had to do with an administration issue. And so this concept around whether or not it was a vaccine failure or the failure to vaccinate within that community or that household or what have you.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. I want to go to Deb Wood from Nurse Zone with a question. Deb, I'll go ahead and turn on your audio and go ahead with your question.
Hi, I actually have 2 questions. How will we know if the vaccines have provided people with the expected immunity and how the immunity may fade over time? Will we be doing titers or antibody tests, or how will we know, say, a year from now if somebody needs to get a booster?
Thanks, Deb, and we'll come back to you for the second one after we get a response to that. Dr. Shen, Dr. McKinney, Dr. Lee, who would like to respond to Deb's question about tracking whether or not the vaccine effectiveness fades over time?
I think the short answer to that is those VE studies are going on. The duration of immunity, you spot on nailed, we don't know yet. What we have authorized for use broadly is under emergency use with a minimum threshold of 8-week safety data, so on and so forth, a minimum trial size of 30,000 and so on. And so those studies are ongoing in addition to corollary studies, for example, collecting on stability as well on the product. And so those VE studies are going on, as well as understanding what the duration of protection is for these candidate vaccines. I'm sure others have a more thorough answer.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. Dr. McKinney or Dr. Lee, do you want to chime in on this too?
I guess I would just, second that statement by saying that, all the companies that have been involved in vaccine development have committed to long-term studies of individuals that are immunized, and they'd like to compare recipients and control groups for as long as possible. They do plan to look at incidents of symptomatic disease from COVID in the future. And I know that there are plans to do at least some periodic monitoring of antibodies of recipients in those trials to see how long the protection might persist based on antibody titer. Of course, the other thing we don't know about immunization is exactly how important relatively T-cell immunity is. T-cell immunity is harder to measure. It's not like just doing an antibody titer, which is a fairly simple procedure, but one that requires several more complicated steps and different procedures entirely. But it may be that even if the antibody levels decline, that the T-cell immunity will persist, and that will be important in protecting individuals who are immunized. So we're going to have studies, periodic blood draws, tests will be done on the recipients in the trials, and probably subsamples of the larger population being immunized, and measurements of the exact incidence of disease. How many people who've been immunized are going to come down with COVID in the future? So we can certainly track among those individuals whether they have a unique strain and whether there's a certain escape that's occurring among particular strains that are out there. I think that's going to really guide the development in the future of the next generation of vaccines, whether we have we go from a monovalent to a bivalent or trivalent or quadrivalent vaccine, because of course for influenza, we've had trivalent vaccines for a long time, ones with 3 different kinds of antigens in there. And more recently, we have ones with 4, 2 influenza A's and 2 influenza B's that are in many now vaccines against flu. So that kind of a vaccine in the future might be a fairly standard one against SARS-CoV-2.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. Deb, please feel free to go ahead with your second question.
Thank you again. But Moderna announced this morning that it's developing a new formula. I think it's to cover the South African variant. How will we distribute that? Will people who have been fully vaccinated need to get a booster with the new formulation, or will it just be something they start doing with the people that are going to get vaccinated?
Dr. Lee, do you have any info about the new Moderna vaccine?
I don't have a lot of new info about the Moderna vaccine, but it's heartening to know that that they're working on I'll call it strain specific, even though I'm not sure that's what they intended, but strain specific vaccines in light of these new variants that are out there. And the mRNA platform allows them to do that very quickly. I think what will be important is how they design their clinical studies and what the data actually shows in terms of how best to take advantage of that. And I'm sure I would expect that they would look at what is the value and the benefit to the individual and to society of having it just be as a booster of the variant. They probably will do other forms of testing, different dosing strategies. And I think it's just a sign that the technology and the platforms are really starting to show their value. Unfortunately, it's we have to go through a global pandemic to drive some of these things forward, but it really is remarkable the speed with which these companies are able to move.
Dr. Shen, what would you add to that?
I think that whether or not it's a booster to the first generation or whether or not it's an actual specifically a new an improvement, i.e. a second generation, it'll still go through the regular processes in which the government asks its advisory committee, the VRBPAC, the advisory committee that advises FDA on what they think about the data in terms of its label indication. And then more directly, Deborah, to your question about distribution and what that will look like, especially relative to an existing one, if it isn't a booster, then the advisory committee on immunization practices, who advises the Centers for Disease Control as well as the department itself, will talk about what that looks like in terms of guidance for use. Having said that, that then feeds into our process around how we distribute and what that administration looks like. Because COVID vaccines are vaccinations for adults, it's anchored on the backbone a lot of what we do really well with kids. But just like in other countries, we are more familiar with vaccinating and have a stronger system for vaccinating children than we do with adults. We have children in immunization registries. The data saturation is around 96, 97%, a little bit less for adolescents, around 85, but we only capture maybe around 60% of data for adults. And so while your question is very directed at the state and stage of where we are in distribution and what the implications are when more things come online, such as either a booster or a second generation Moderna, in this case, vaccine, it'll go through first the VRBPAC for indication, and maybe it is not the exact same indication as the first generation, and then through the advisory committee on immunization practices as to what's the guidance for use. And then it'll filter down into the distribution channels. The way in which we vaccinate routinely looks different than what we're talking about now in large volume, large throughput places like Dodger Stadium, the I'm not from Texas, the Astrodome, and drive-through in large, stadiums and things like that, as opposed to when you take your children or your grandchildren to the pediatrician in specific provider practices in the medical home. And so it will most likely go through similarly to where we're moving now because we're vaccinating adults, and exactly how that will roll out will depend on its license authorization as well as its recommendations for use.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. Thank you for your questions, Deb. I want to ask to Dr. Lee. We were talking about Deb's question about another new formulation getting started, but we've also got a few other vaccines that are close to the final steps of approval. What can you tell us about those forthcoming vaccines? How do they differ from the mRNA? How else do they differ in terms of storage? How many doses are needed? Other things like that. What can we expect as those potentially come online and into the fray?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time that there's more vaccines becoming potentially available. I think the new vaccines that are being talked about now, certainly in the news, the Johnson & Johnson company has talked about the promising results that they seem to have with their vaccine. That's an adenovirus-based vaccine platform. It's a different, fundamentally a slightly different type of way to inject somebody with the vaccine and solicit an immune response. But it's also designed to work very, very quickly, that once you know what the sequence of the virus in this case is, that you could rapidly develop and manufacture a vaccine. the interesting things about that platform are that the doses themselves don't require some of the very specialized cold chain delivery and storage conditions. They are a little more robust at higher temperatures, meaning that it might be easier to imagine getting those vaccines out to different communities where you don't have to have the ultra low temperature freezer, for example. You can think about standard refrigerator temperatures. You can think about room temperature for periods of time. And I think that will make it easier for the so-called shots to get into the arms, because you don't need that set of logistics. The data isn't out there just yet on that. I think Johnson & Johnson has talked about their top level observations and results, but they are expected to file an emergency use authorization with the FDA. And I think as that process unfolds, and Dr. Shen just kind of mentioned what some of the key steps in that are, that more of the data will become available that will show some of the specifics around the efficacy of their particular vaccine. But at the top level, they've reported, I think, between 65 and 85, depending on how you look at it, percent efficacy for their vaccine. And you might initially say, that sounds lower than what I was hearing about the mRNA vaccines. But what you have to remember, and this is something that that company has talked about very openly, when they were doing their testing, they were testing at a time when the variants were now circulating in the UK and South Africa near the end of 2020. Whereas when the Pfizer and Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna vaccines were being tested, those variants hadn't yet been identified. So it might not be surprising that that the efficacy might be a little bit lower, but what they've reported is they've had very good efficacy on preventing hospitalization and death. And once that data becomes available, I think those are really critical to proper functioning of our society and trying to get back to a sense of normal.
Dr. Shen, what would you add to that?
I would add just a cherry on top to what Kevin has said, is largely one dose is very key for dose completion. We all know that after you get in for that one shot, that if you have to go back to a second, there's a chance, there's a probability or a possibility that that may or may not happen. We see that in routine vaccines that require 3 or 4 shots. And so one dose, I think, is going to be really pivotal, in addition to having more supply because it's a one dose regimen, but also to ensure that it's complete, because after you get the one, you're somewhat one and done.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. We have another question from Dan Keller. Dan, go ahead with your question.
Here's kind of a shot in the dark. Is there any thought of engineering a live, non-pathogenic SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that could be transmitted person to person in the population to spread immunity, even to those people who are vaccine resistant? And I guess vaccinees could be encouraged to sneeze at each other.
Thank you, Dan. Any of our panelists have any thoughts about that concept? Dan,
I think you framed something very controversial. I think that it is probably analogous to folks' response to perhaps the human challenge studies. And I don't know if anyone's thinking about doing this, but it's certainly a very creative question, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Dr. McKinney, go ahead.
I'm just going to say that, of course, we have had in the past a vaccine that was developed a number of years ago, actually, and that was temporarily off the market, but it's back again. A live influenza vaccine that can be administered intranasally, right? And that vaccine, that sort of general thought that you develop a virus that's adapted to live in the nasal area, but can't reproduce well internally and does not cause disease in humans. That would be a really interesting advance, but that would take some time to have, studies that proved it's both safe and effective, that you're not going to cause inadvertent disease, especially with the number of people we have in the U.S. who are immune suppressed. You don't want to give any kind of live immunization to somebody whose immune system is not functioning properly, who's got an organ transplant and is on high dose any kind of agents that would be suppressing immunity if they're on cancer, chemotherapy, et cetera. So that would be very tricky. It would be great in a sense to have it, but the process of getting there and ensuring safety would be a very complex one.
Dr. McKinney, how do you feel that the new vaccines coming out, hopefully in the short period of time, how should they fit into the rollout of the national strategy? Is there justification for focusing maybe the single dose vaccines that don't need cold storage, shipping those to certain areas, whereas other vaccines are better handled in different cities? And what are your thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, everyone knows that the first vaccine introduced, the Pfizer vaccine, requires ultra cold storage down to minus 70 Celsius. That's very difficult to maintain and achieve and maintain for sites that are remote. And it's hard to transport the vaccine safely from place to place over longer distances into rural areas and things like that. That vaccine has to be thawed and then diluted and then withdrawn and then injected. So a lot of different steps as well. If the Johnson & Johnson vaccine can be safely stored at refrigerator temperatures, which is the claim from the manufacturer, that it will be stable for a period of months at refrigeration temperatures, which are around 40 degrees Fahrenheit or so, above freezing, but around 40 or 42. Be maintained there, it would be much more safely transported to rural areas, and with one dose injection, simpler to administer. There's no follow-up. It would make a lot of sense, in my view, to have that vaccine targeted for those more remote sites, and to have the the concentrated effort for these difficult to administer vaccines in major centers where they have the ultra cold storage readily available, and a lot more personnel who can be a part of this complex process of the thawing, diluting, withdrawing, administering process, which does get complicated when you do it on a large scale.
We mentioned briefly in another question that the testing of some of the new vaccines, they're up against the different variants that are out there. So Dr. McKinney, I want to ask you for further thoughts about these different variants. And while they do seem to be still be covered by these vaccines that are getting tested, maybe not as highly as the first strains that were out, how much risk is there that one of these mutations does escape the vaccines, and what other thoughts should we understand about that possibility?
Well, there's a significant risk that will happen eventually. Everyone hoped that mutations would occur at a lower rate than they are occurring currently with this virus, but it's had such an unimpeded spread in the world, in the global population, that imagine how many times the virus has multiplied. It's an RNA virus. It's well known these RNA viruses have poor error checking mechanisms when they replicate. So mutations happen all the time. They happen randomly, but certain ones assist the virus in being more transmissible. Some may assist it in being more pathogenic, although we haven't seen ones that are definitely more pathogenic yet. So one of the things we have to—
Hello, this is Dan Keller.
Sorry about that, Dr. McKinney, go right
One of
ahead.
the things we really have to, we have to focus on is, what other areas of the virus are mutating? Are there portions of the viral genome that are well preserved? We know that the spike protein, the S protein, which is the one we're tracking, mutates fairly frequently. But what about the others? And is there a way to target them even more effectively, because perhaps the mutation rate in those areas is less frequent? So there's a lot we have to know, and I don't know of anyone who has that information yet for us, but it certainly is the reason that is driving the race to the finish line to get our target group immunized as quickly as possible. And no one's mentioned this yet, but of course, all the studies that we have in the US so far are really done on adults. And the Pfizer group did a few 16 and 17-year-olds, but largely 18 and above, and Moderna exclusively 18 and above. So to get to the children in the US, adolescents and kids, there have to be special studies done there. They're beginning, but they have a long way to go. And roughly a quarter of our population is under the age of 18 here in the US. So what is that? That's roughly, 80 million or something like that. So it's a large number that would need to be addressed by these studies yet to be completed that show safety and efficacy of the existing vaccines in children. So Getting to the finish line with adults is important, but then we have to, as well, be cognizant of the fact that kids should get protection as well, and as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. Dr. Shen, back to you. Dr. McKinney just referenced the unchecked spread as a major concern with the mutations. Well, we have a new administration at the helm in the United States, and there's a lot of reporting that they're planning to get more involved in the process. What do you think are some of the positive impacts, and how soon we can start to see some of the effects as they get their plans up and running?
It's a good question. I think that, as you noted, good things are happening. And as I earlier opened with, that more vaccine supply is coming. And so I think that is a game changer. From what I would expect from the administration at the federal level, perhaps falls into two domains. I'd expect more coordination and more communication. So in terms of coordination, as more vaccines come out, as soon as they are filled and vialed and packaged, they're literally out the door. And one of the main things we learned in the H1N1 response over 10 years ago is that communication on those doses, when they're coming and where they're going, is really critical to the vaccination campaign itself, because of all of the architecture and all the work behind the scenes related to the scheduling of vaccination appointments, the optimization of the number of folks there, especially for high throughput doses. And so I think that as we have more sites of service coming on, as we're building and expanding where you can get vaccine, both high volume as well as low volume, that coordination will be key. I think there's potentially more funding for vaccine administration. Whenever you take a vaccine, you have to pay for the vaccine vial, the dose itself, as well as the provider, the administration of that, including the crinkly paper that you sit on, the Band-Aid and things like that. And so some of those administration fees are very low. And so I think that there could be potentially more funding for administration. There's certainly going to be more support to the states, support meaning people support, as well as funds. Public health infrastructure and public health has been underfunded for over 10 years. And then I think the fourth point I would expect, which we're already seeing in terms of immediately, is transparency in data and those dashboards around virus cases, around testing, number of tests, around vaccinations per day and hospitalizations. And those data are really important, not just for transparency in building trust in the community about the process and about the vaccine and vaccination, but also data for decision making all the way down to state and local levels. Those are the things that I expect forthcoming, and those I think will have positive impacts both in the community as well as in the practical operations of the deployments of vaccines itself.
Dr. Lee, what's your perspective on the better federal coordination and what the results may be in the manufacturing end of the equation, where you have the most familiarity? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is there's kind of a stated intent to be more engaged and more involved and help with that coordination. I think that's very important. I think the companies themselves do a lot of that manufacturing, and the extent to which there could be supply chain limitations, knowing that the federal government might be willing to step in and alleviate some bottlenecks, I think is important. I don't know that there are easy fixes on substantially increasing the manufacturing rate where the government can have a direct impact today. But that said, it's not just about what is in that vial. There's a need for syringes. There's the need, of course, for the PPE to administer the vaccine. So all of that, I think, are also important areas where federal coordination and aid can certainly accelerate the availability of vaccines. And when it comes to distribution of those vaccines, I think what Dr. Shen was saying is exactly right. I think we've seen right now a very kind of distributed, in my opinion, way of encouraging that vaccination to happen. So it gets there's high level guidance from the CDC, but a lot of the details are left to the states. And at the state level, there's some activity, and in other states it gets pushed to the counties. And as you go down into organizations, each of those entities then has to think about how do you schedule this? How am I going to ensure that how many doses am I going to have? How many people to line up? Where are they going to line up? Where are they going to wait for 15 minutes? And I think that's a lot of reinventing of the wheel, I think, is happening all across the country. There's benefits to being close to the patients because you know what's happening locally. But I think greater federal coordination would probably smooth out some of the bumps that we've seen. I'll add, one additional perspective, which is not if, but when we finish, vaccinating the majority of the U.S. population. To go back to the earlier point, I think we also have to turn our attention to making sure that the rest of the world is also adequately vaccinated, because as we talked about before, variants can emerge. And as long as this virus is circulating in other parts of our globalized world, we still have a risk here. And so I think being a part of that global community to ensure that developed and developing nations have access to vaccines, I think is going to be important for our own public health.
Digging into that a little bit further, what is kind of the current limiting factor for how well the vaccine is getting distributed in those other countries, both developed and less developed? Is it the power of their governments to purchase these things, or are there other factors?
I think
supply.
From what I know about this is, there is a globalized community that has established some principles and ways to ensure that not only the developed and wealthier nations have access to the vaccine, but that the developing world does as well. And so I think there are frameworks in place, and I think what we want to do is make sure that I would argue we want to make sure that we are supportive of that infrastructure, because at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, it's going to come back to get us if we don't ensure that the population of the planet, to the extent possible, is vaccinated.
Dr. Shen, how could you explain some of the differing rates of success at administering the vaccine across different nations? And you mentioned supply as the factor in this question. What are your thoughts?
Building on what Dr. Lee had said, supply is very limited, not just here, but in the global distribution. The COVAX facility is the vaccine arm of the ACT Accelerator, which is a global effort that Dr. Lee had mentioned within global frameworks on how to get access, equitable access across all nations to COVID products, therapeutics, diagnostics, so on. So COVAX is the one specifically for vaccines, with their mission to ensure equitable access to these low and middle income countries. And so the initial plans for COVAX are to start with 3% of the population in terms of allocating doses there and ramping up to 20% and beyond. That really covers a fraction of the population writ large. But the idea is to getting a little bit to all, a lot of it confounded by the numbers, and a lot of deals being made with manufacturers, both in developing countries as well as in industrialized countries, with these multinational companies, as opposed, in addition to Indian manufacturers, Chinese manufacturers, to ramp up just the number of doses purely. I think that relative to us in the United States, it's a really good sign that the Biden administration has rejoined the World Health Organization, WHO, and in this regard signals some optimism in terms of addressing these issues about global equity, in that these vaccines, these strains, I think I said in another press conference that vaccine nationalism only helps the virus itself. So toward this end, it's important not just for equitable access and distribution in this country, but across all countries globally, since this is something that's impacting all of us collectively together.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. A little bit of a free play question. I'm not sure which of our panelists might like to answer it, but in doing some research about some possible misinformation out there about the vaccine, one question has come up about rumors maybe speculating that it could lead to infertility. Is there anything to this rumor? Is there any information backing this up, or is that something that needs to be debunked? Any of the panelists have any thoughts about that or any knowledge about it? Hate to throw a curveball, but it is one of the things that we were doing some research about, and it came up as a question from the public.
I don't have any specific data for you, but I can tell you that people in the vaccine trials became pregnant after immunization, or in the process of immunization. So I don't think there's any evidence that supports the notion that people are immunized are infertile. So I don't know where the rumor is coming from. There's a lot of wild speculation in a lot of different areas, of course, that are circulating in this current period of time that has differing views against each other in different political factions and things like that. But no, in terms of scientific data, there's nothing at all that supports that I'm aware of. And in fact, definitely some contrary evidence in terms of the pregnancies occurring among people who've been immunized.
Thanks, Dr. McKinney. Dr. Shen, go ahead.
I think my only quick comment is, aside from always being intrigued by what comes up in terms of the myths and the unfounded or misinformation, oftentimes the genesis of this has to do with kind of an association with something else that's happening oftentimes in those people's lives, and so given the context of, if certain folks are trying to get pregnant, it's associated with getting a COVID vaccine, and then things kind of spiral out from there. And so in terms of the world of mysticism, rumor, and misinformation, oftentimes the association itself is not causation. It just happens that two things happened at the same time. And we don't have enough time for stories, but usually I tell a story.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. I think it would be remarkable if that were true and it had somehow been kept quiet. It seems like something like that would be widely reported and widely investigated, and not be something that could be chalked up to a myth. Just to be clear, that myth had circulated in foreign countries with regard to things like polio vaccine. Mm-hmm. The polio vaccine might in fact cause it, right? So, and that's clearly been debunked. So there's no reason to suspect that there's any greater credence to be attached to the links that have been proposed in social media to infertility with COVID vaccine. Yeah, more likely then that someone brushed off some old propaganda from a previous vaccine 60 years ago and decided to see if it would get traction today. With time enough for one last question, I want to go to Dr. Lee. And it's a question similar to one I asked of Dr. Shen earlier, but your thoughts on continuing with public health measures and the importance of that, even while the vaccine gets out there, and what would you say to convince people to stick with that in the rare case that maybe they could still be a carrier even after they got a vaccine and infect someone else, or any other thoughts about those issues?
Yeah, that's a really important topic. And I think the messaging that we're hearing from officials is exactly what we want to hear, which is that just because you've got the vaccine doesn't mean you should stop wearing a mask, and it doesn't mean you should stop your physical distancing in certain situations. It's particularly important. It's going to help you. It's going to help your loved ones. It's going to help the first responders. It's going to help the healthcare workers by continuing to keep this pandemic spread as limited as possible. There's a number of reasons why one could still get sick immediately after you take your first dose, for example. You haven't built up that immunity yet. So you want to make sure that you are fully protected. And even then, there isn't enough data, I don't think yet, to suggest that even if you are fully protected, that you might not be able to transmit the disease. And so you want to make sure that you are being as safe as possible to protect you and your loved ones. Until we have more information to suggest that maybe it's not. And I'm sure the health officials will come out and let everyone know when it's safe to start to relax.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. I want to just remind everyone on the call that we'll have a video and a transcript produced of today's event that we can share with you afterward. If you registered, you're on the list to get that. If you didn't register and you just clicked from an invite, email us at info@newswise.com and we'll make sure you get that information. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Shen, Dr. McKinney, and Dr. Lee. We appreciate having you. And we'll say now to everyone, thank you very much for joining, and stay safe, stay healthy, and good luck.
Great. Thanks so much.